What if the hardest grief you've ever faced wasn't about someone dying, but about finally letting go of someone who is still alive? There's another kind of grief that we don't talk about enough, and that is the grief of soul ties and trauma bonds. You see, sometimes the loss isn't about death, it's about losing access, it's about losing the connection, it's about losing what you've hoped the relationship would become. And when chaos becomes familiar, letting go doesn't feel like peace at all. It feels like panic because your nervous system may have learned to confuse attachment with safety. So you're not just grieving a person, you're grieving the hope, you're grieving the potential, and you're grieving the version of love that you have been fighting for all of this time. In today's episode, episode 8, and our final part of our grief series, we're going to be talking about how to understand and let go of unhealthy attachments without shame and how healing begins when you finally choose your peace.
He placed this voice within me, and I'm answering his call. I choose light when life feels broken. I choose faith when hope feels small. This is my destiny to speak healing, hope, and love. Yeah, I've answered his call.
Welcome back to The Bad, the Ugly, the Good, and Healing You. I am your host, Dr. Jenita Griffin, also known as Doc G. So today we're going to be continuing our grief series episode, and this is our final part. Today we're going to be talking about grief that comes when attachment and healing collides. I first want to discuss what we call soul ties. Now, I know it sounds spiritual, but oftentimes their emotional attachments form through things like pain, form through things like intimacy, survival, even like fear of abandonment or unhealed childhood wounds. They can even be formed where people don't know any different. So they are formed because a person doesn't know anything different than the chaos or the toxicity. For example, if you are someone who has grown up in a household where there is always constant chaos or toxicity, oftentimes that's all you know. And that becomes normal to you. That becomes familiar to you. That becomes something that you just know. You don't know anything different. And because you don't know anything different, you don't know what to compare it to. When this is all you know and that pain becomes familiar, it could feel like home. These are bonds that often reinforce when the emotional pain is repeated. It's like a cycle. And that's why it hurts more for a person to let go of a soul tie. And it's not just because the relationship was healthy for you, it's because your nervous system is conditioned and your body is conditioned to associate that attachment with safety and comfort or even survival. And this is where the grief becomes confusing. You're not really truly grieving that person. You're grieving the hope. You're grieving the potential. You're grieving that version of that relationship you kept fighting for all this time. This is what you're grieving. You're not grieving that person at all. You're grieving all of what you hoped it to be. And truth be told, not every deep connection is divine. I feel like not everything that comes our way and that we encounter is godly. I feel like some connections are lessons, some connections are just mirrors for us to reflect and look upon ourselves and how we behave and what we do. I feel like some encounters are stepping stones toward our healing or breakthrough. And if you've ever wondered if you're dealing with a unhealthy soul tie, These are some signs, okay? You may feel emotionally pulled back even after deciding to leave. Have you ever felt that way? Emotionally pulled back even when you decided to leave? You're in a negative relationship and it's not good for you. But you make a decision finally after all this time to get out and to just move on. And soon as you do that, something happens where you are emotionally pulled back into this relationship. And you're often confusing that longing with love. And that is far from love, truth be told. You may even feel anxious, guilty, or even empty without that person. You may feel that even when you have disconnected from that person physically, you may feel like you are emotionally connected to that person. So even though you have gotten out of the situation, you still feel emotionally drawn to that person. And that's that pullback I was talking about. And in some instances, you feel responsible for that other person's healing. And that's where the trap comes in. That's where that emotional pullback comes in. And this is not weakness. This is what we call soul tie. And this is a form of conditioning that happens when we are emotionally attached. And breaking a soul tie isn't about pretending that you don't care, it's about grieving honestly. It's about finally releasing what cost you your peace and letting go. So, moving into the bad, this is when that attachment feels safer to just stay in versus to just let go. And that's what I coin as the bad. And I feel like most often unhealthy attachment really begin where they are unhealthy. If we encountered an attachment that is toxic and unhealthy upon initially meeting that person, then we wouldn't be in it for the long haul. We wouldn't attach ourselves to where we're falling in love and we're getting to know that person more. After one initial encounter, most often people don't go back. They just stay away from that person. So I feel like most unhealthy relationships don't necessarily start where they are toxic or chaotic. Most often start where they are of good intentions. And when I say good intentions, they start initially where there is some type of connection, some type of bond, some type of belonging, or you may even feel seen or loved. Many of us were taught that holding on equals strength, and it's something positive. It speaks to endurance, it speaks to positivity. And we're taught that letting go is like failure and it's like giving up. So people stay attached to the relationship, to those roles, or to those identities long after the relationship has stopped being healthy. And most often, I feel like most people stay. Oftentimes, a lot of people stay because of the history of the relationship. We played in a sandbox together. So I have this long history with this person. And so it's hard for me to let go. And even though the relationship has turned into something where it's toxic and abusive, because you've known this person from the sandbox, you find it hard to let go of that attachment. Or even they may have it to where they hope and imagining and wanting and wishing for that person to be what they were is stronger than actually what it is, their reality. So the reality of it is this person is a jerk and you hope and wish and want them to be the person that you initially had a healthier relationship with. And then what happens when all of that takes place? We begin that internal dialogue where fear starts to whisper little things like, you won't find this type of connection again. Or sometimes, again, you're not attached to the person, you're attached to who they used to be, or maybe who you hope they would become, who you imagine, who you envision. And sometimes you're really grieving that identity, that role you played with that person. You were the rescuer, you were the strong one, you were the provider. You are grieving that role, that relationship. You're the one who held everything together. You're the one who takes care of everything. And so when that role shifts or that role is no longer apparent and you're out of that relationship, grief shows up. And then the question becomes, who am I without that person, without that connection? And that fear keeps people emotionally tied to what hurts them way longer than what they need to be. And I'm here to tell you that you are not weak for feeling that pull, that soul tie. You are human. It's just better to know and understand what you're dealing with and assess that to where you can actually heal yourself and look at letting go. So, before we get into trauma bonds, I want to pause here for a second because I feel like many of you may have this thought of what the internal struggle sounds like in theory, but I want to kind of give you an example. So, what I did was I created a skit, and this is what it could sound like when both healing and attachment are speaking to you at the same time. So, tune in.
Attachment, old self. I know it hurt. But what if I could have been different? What if I didn't try hard enough? At least when they were here, I wasn't alone.
Healed self, you weren't alone, you were surviving. And survival is not the same as safety.
But it still feels like losing them means losing part of me.
You're not losing yourself. You're reclaiming yourself from a bond that kept you small.
What if I never feel that connection again?
Peace feels different than chaos. You're not afraid of losing them. You're afraid of feeling unfamiliar calm.
It hurts to let go.
It hurts to stay too, but only one of those paths leads to healing.
It's the internal grief that many people don't talk about, the tug of war between attachment and healing, between who you were and who you are becoming. And this is why soul ties are so hard to break. And it's not because you're weak, but it's because the attachment that forms in pain often feels like survival, so that the attached person can feel that it is actually spiritual, but it's actually survival and not spiritual. This is also why trauma bonds feel so spiritual, because survival feels like it's sacred, but it's actually feels like living without safety. So when you are living without safety, you are someone who's just surviving, going day to day, just trying to get to the next day. And it can be uncertain and it can be scary and it can be so much fear that a person would feel when they don't have safety and they're just surviving, going day to day. And so I want to talk about what's really happening underneath, and that is what we're talking about with the trauma bonds. And this is more so when attachment and trauma intertwine, the bond doesn't feel like it lives just in the heart. It also lives in the nervous system. And this is what's really happening underneath. A trauma bond forms when emotional pain or fear or inconsistency becomes tied to that connection. The relationship would move in cycles where there's a closeness and a distance, or there's a harm and there's apology, there's chaos and there's calm. And most often, trauma bonds are psychological attachments that form through this type of cycle, this type of repeated cycle of pain and relief. For example, if you are someone who's in an abusive relationship and you are experiencing a trauma bond, what's underneath is that cycle. Think about when I think about what love has to do with it, Tina Turner. When I think about that, I think about how he physically assaulted her, and then the next day he was giving gifts. That is a cycle. That is an abusive cycle that takes place. And oftentimes, people, kind of become conditioned to it where their body starts to react to it. It develops through emotional harm, through the inconsistency, through neglect, through the abuse. All of that takes place in a trauma bond, and it's repeated over and over and over again. And so, again, the body becomes associated with it. This is why it's so hard to detach from a spiritual bond, well, a spiritual soul tie and a trauma bond, because the closeness and the relationship kind of moves in cycles from distance to closeness and harm to apology and chaos and calm. Over time, your nervous system associates that intensity with that attachment. And that's why leaving doesn't feel like relief. Because when the person actually leaves, it feels like panic and they start to withdraw. The loss is on a physiological level. And spiritually, again, people may describe this as being a soul tie, but it's not actually the soul tie. Psychologically, it's conditioning where the body is grieving the attachment, not the actual person. Okay. And that this type of grief, even though there's an absent, because you are emotionally connected, emotional captivity occurs. This is when the trauma and the attachment intertwine and connect with one another. The trauma is actually when the bond is conditioned by the body, and the soul tie is actually the binding, which it is the heart and the spirit. Together, they create what they call emotional captivity. So, what is emotional captivity? Emotional captivity is when the body is free, but the emotional bond is still there. You are bound. You feel tied to someone long after the relationship ends. Your thoughts, your energy, and your emotions remain entangled in that attachment. You may be physically free from it, you are emotionally bound, and your thoughts starts to stay attached with that attachment. And this is why you have so many people saying things like, I know it's unhealthy, but I still miss that person. I don't understand why I can't move on. You can't move on because this is the trauma bond. And you have so many people who are in abusive relationships, and often people from the outside look at it and say, why can't they just move on? This person is beating them, and there's emotional neglect, and there's this cycle, and it's clear from the outside as being toxic and unhealthy. But to the person, even though they break free, their body starts to act connected. So they are conditioned. And I feel like the ugly truth of it all is that trauma bonds mimic love. And that's the deceit, that's the illusion of it. And the fear is disguises itself as loyalty, and the grief becomes tangled with survival, and that is the illusion. So when the relationship feels unstable, the bond can feel stronger. So when there's chaos, there's toxicity, there's the emotional highs and the cycle, it feels like the bond is stronger when it's actually should be weaker. And that's all because the nervous system mistakes the intensity for the connection, and the bond begins to go into that cycle. Okay. And so, what happens when that bond and that grief sneaks back in? That grief, you're grieving the emotional highs. You look at hoping that person would change. You're looking at that version of yourself that survived inside of that chaos. And that grief feels confusing and it's intense, even shame filled. So, research says that Trauma bonding is a strong emotional attachment where fear and reward are both mixed together. Okay. And that's how the body becomes conditioned to survive the relationship. Okay. So moving into the good, you guys, moving into the good. So, what's the good of it all? The good is that you can heal from a soul tie or trauma bond. And so healing is possible even without the closure, and moving forward doesn't mean that you forget about the relationship, forget about the attachment. Doesn't mean that. It just simply means that you are integrating the experience of letting go without letting it define you any further. And healing doesn't begin with you just letting it go. Healing begins when you understand that connection and you understand that relationship. So if it's a trauma bond, healing often starts with helping your nervous system feel safe without chaos. And if it feels like a soul tie, healing may involve grieving honestly, such as finding meaning and looking at how to spiritually release what no longer serves you. You're looking at the meaning behind all of that. And that's how you release a soul tie. Oftentimes, we look at both approaches because trauma affects the body, whereas the soul ties affects the meaning and emotion. So for a trauma bond, the goal is to help you regulate safety. You look at breaking the survival patterns and relearning or teaching you safety. So, healing may look like your nervous system during moments of chaos or where you feel unsafe. You're looking at deep breathing or grounding exercises. You're looking at associating positive things, walking, stretching when you feel uncomfortable and you don't feel safe. Okay. Your body has to learn that calm is safe again. Therapy, you're looking at therapy. You got to understand how to rewire what you've come to believe and what you come to know. CBT is often most helpful. You're challenging the negative thoughts of a person to help them feel whole, to look at how to change those faulty and maladaptive beliefs into healthier thought patterns. Okay. You have EMDR for unresolved trauma memories. You're looking at attach based therapy. These are ways of how you can look at rewiring what you've come to believe and know as to how to detach yourself from a trauma bond. Tune in for a short ad break. If you've been feeling overwhelmed, discouraged, or emotionally drained, this is for you. This is my I Coach Me wall calendar where it's just more than words on a wall, it's monthly motivation for you. I've been creating these since 2019. Each new month is a fresh opportunity for you to reset, refocus, and keep healing forward. You're focusing on areas such as why does intensity feel like love? You're processing all of that and you're looking at rewiring. You are understanding your unhealed childhood wounds, your unhealed trauma wounds. You're looking at understanding and processing and learning more about that and essentially learning more about you. You're looking at breaking those rescue patterns, that savior pattern, that rescuing everybody. You're looking at breaking those cycles. You may look at setting boundaries, and healing with this often requires real life change, not just insight, not just looking at to change what you're thinking. You're looking at setting up safety perimeters and boundaries, examples such as blocking your triggers. You may have social media or text reminders. You're looking at limiting that or setting boundaries with that to where you're no longer being pulled back or lured into that type of behavior. You're looking at taking accountability from trusted support systems. You're looking at identity rebuilding. People often need to discover who they are. They need to reconnect with learning new hobbies. They may not like the things they used to like. 5 years, 10 years ago. So they're looking at reconnecting with those hobbies. You may look at reconnecting with your friendships and creating new, healthier routines that are not tied to that attachment. You're also looking at self worth work. If it feels like a trauma bond, you're looking at naming that attachment. Is it the person or the feeling? Or is it really love or is it emptiness or fear that I'm feeling? Or is it connection or is it identity that I'm connecting and attaching myself with? For many people who are attached to feeling, they're looking at being needed or being seen or being safe. And you must name that attachment in order to reduce that shame associated with correcting and healing a trauma bond. Okay. Also, you're looking at separating the grief from the attachment. Oftentimes, you have it where grief says, "This mattered to me." And your attachment says, "I can't survive without this." So you have your body reacting, and you can't survive living without that person. Healing begins when you honor the grief without obeying that attachment. You don't have to rewrite your history and your experience with that person. You just have to stop letting the past control your present and look at letting go of what no longer serves you and look at naming it and look at tackling one trigger at a time. Also, you're looking at making meaning out of that relationship. You're looking at how you can go about regulating your emotions, that emotion, that unhealthy attachment that lives in your body. You have to look at how you can let go of what it feels like, that emotional high, that panic, that anxiety, that emptiness, that withdrawal. You have to look at all of that. And again, this doesn't mean that you're weak. It just means that your nervous system has learned to survive that chaos. And you have to look at what feels normal, what feels calm, and you have to look at healing that so that you can obtain your peace in that calmness. Healing may look like engaging in of course, like I said, therapy, the grounding practices, the rest. Healing looks at all of that, setting your boundaries and looking at being consistent with healing that part of you. Sometimes you're not missing that person, your body is just learning how to feel safe without them. It takes patience. It takes compassion. It takes loving kindness of yourself to no longer allow yourself to be pulled back into it, allowing yourself to heal. The other thing is you have to look at redefining letting go. Okay. Letting go does not mean that you erase the past, you pretend you don't care, you are minimizing what you shared with that attachment, that person. Letting go simply means releasing that control the past has over your present and looking at grounding and working with what you have in your present. You can appreciate what was without returning to what harmed you or without being pulled back into that attachment. And sometimes grief doesn't end with closure, it ends with self trust. It feels like it's ending with you being able to love you, trust you, and have that inner intuition about what's best for you and how to heal you. So if it feels like a soul tie, the goal would be to have the person experience emotional release and making meaning out of the attachment or the relationship in general. And one of the ways you can do that is journaling letters you don't send. Look at naming what you are truly grieving. You're not just grieving a person, you're releasing hope, you're releasing the dreams, you're releasing the identity you had when you were attached with that person. You can look at guided reflection or inner child work. These are things that you can uncover and work with a therapist in healing that soul tie. Prompt example question I would ask is, what did I believe that connection would give me? Ask yourself that honestly and answer it. And that's how you can start going about understanding your connection with that soul tie and how to release it. Okay. Meaning making and reflection. This helps transform pain into growth. And an example question, ask yourself, what did the relationship teach me? You can identify the patterns that you no longer want to repeat, those unhealthy patterns that you engaged in. You can look at exploring lessons instead of blaming that other person for that cycle. You have to look at making meaning and doing some deep self reflection. Some connections are mirrors and they're not destinations. So you have to look at what you can learn and what did that experience teach you so that you can make sure you're not repeating and engaging in those same behaviors. Spiritual relief practices. And so when I look at spiritual relief practices, this is for people who resonate spiritually. Release can feel symbolic or powerful, even. Look at prayer and spiritual reflection, writing and safely destroying a release letter, guided visualization of cutting emotional cords with that attachment, forgiveness work. Forgiveness work without reopening access to that person. You can forgive that person, but you don't have to give them a doorway back into your life. Spiritual relief does not mean returning to that relationship. Again, just because you are forgiving that person and you're looking at spiritual release doesn't necessarily mean that you have to give them a doorway back into your life. Okay. Self compassion and acceptance. Many people feel shame for still feeling attached to that person, even though, there was abuse, there was neglect. Many people feel ashamed by that. And treatment includes things like normalizing that emotional attachment residue, practicing self kindness and forgiveness of yourself, even accepting that grief can exist without you reuniting with that person. Okay. And when I look at this, I look at setting up stages where, you got to name that pull and you look at asking yourself, what exactly do I feel pulled back towards? And again, we're talking about spiritual soul ties. So remember, that is an emotional pull. And so you're going to ask yourself these questions so that you can prepare yourself to make sure that you are not lured or pulled back into that situation. You can ask yourself, is the person or the way I felt when I was with them, is that something that's pulling you back? Take a minute and think about those questions, okay? Because sometimes we're not missing the person, we're missing the feeling that we were chosen or we were needed or we were seen. So you have to name that pull. You have to also name the grief. Ask yourself, what am I actually grieving right now? Is it the relationship as it really was, or is it the version that I hoped it would become? The future I imagine, the part of me that I tried so hard to keep in this relationship. Allow yourself to answer those questions honestly. Again, we talked about how trauma bond is associated physiologically with your body. You got to look at noticing your body. As you think about letting go, notice, do I feel calm or do I feel anxious? Or do I feel tightness in my chest? Is there a knot in my stomach? Is fear rising? This isn't weakness. This is just your trauma bond, that physiological condition attachment. Your body is remembering that survival that you had when you were in that attachment. Okay. And most important, the last with soul tie, you want to look at choosing a truth. Quietly say to yourself, something can matter and still not be healthy for me. I can miss someone and still choose peace, or letting go does not erase what happened. It does not erase that love and that relationship. Let those words settle as you ask yourself those questions. Okay. So, in closing, I want to ask you a question. I want you to answer this for yourself. I want you to reflect on, what am I really grieving? If you're driving, I just want you to listen. If you're somewhere quiet, just, you know, take a pause and take a deep breath with me. Okay. This isn't about judgment. This is about honesty, and this is about healing you. I want you to take a slow, deep breath in, and I want you to exhale. Now, I want you to ask yourself, if letting go feels like losing yourself, maybe the real healing is finally finding who you are without the pain. Take a deep breath and sit with that for a moment. I want you to just notice what comes up for you. No pressure, no rushing, no forcing it. What comes up for you? No shame. Sometimes the first step in breaking a soul tie or even a trauma bond is simply being honest with yourself about understanding and knowing what that attachment really is and what you're holding on to. Healing doesn't always begin when the pain ends. Sometimes healing begins when you finally choose your peace and you finally start trusting you. I thank you for sitting in this conversation with me today. I am so happy to be here. I am Dr. Jenita Griffin, also known as Doc G. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. So, that said, signing off. Love you, be good to you, and expect great things for you. Until next time.
He placed this voice within me, and I'm answering his call.